Hello and welcome to Michael and Ivanka's Grand Podcast, a podcast where we search for meaning. My name's Michael Forrest.
And I'm Ivanka Magic.
This week we're talking about Judgement.
That sounds quite heavy.
These all sound quite heavy. That's the problem.
Do you think they put people off?
We know that it puts people off now. We have
one data point.
We have, like evidence, but, I've been suspecting this for a while. I had a bit of a freak out this week about, is it better to go the other way, like the Buffy route, where you have something that is ostensibly very shiny and commercial and friendly and easy in genre, and which then brings in much deeper themes as part of its narrative while still servicing that sort of like entertainment thing? Or is it better to just make it all everything look like homework?
I don't know. I really don't know. I have thought about it, but despite my profession, I've done no research on the subject.
Well, we could do a little survey, couldn't we?
We could. I don't know what the
poll.
Survey.
I'll just say poll. Is Grand Podcasts, do they always sound too hard? Well, how often do you feel like listening to us? Never.
No, just
nearly never.
Really hard work. Should we talk about this week?
Let's get started.
We've not
then.
Have we finished?
Into the music.
Michael, how was your week?
My week. I've been thinking about rich executioners. Apparently, the executioner class was a sort of slightly separate type of person that wasn't allowed to mix with normal people. And even though they could get lots of money and they did the jobs that people didn't want to do, this is back in the old days. I was listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I thought it was interesting that they could actually be really rich, but they would still be sort of total outcasts because of what they do. And, they had to sort of marry other executioner families, So it was this strange sort of weird social caste. So it's funny to think of a rich but still ostracised social caste.
I mean, you can understand why they might be ostracised.
Yes.
I mean, what in you makes you be that?
Well, it's like your dad was one, I think, and then you're sort of like stuck with it, really. Once your father's an executioner, you're kind of from an executioner family, and you just have to learn to do that, and you don't really get to go, well, I thought I might be an artist, because basically, if no one's allowed to sit with you in a tavern, no one, there was all these kind of social rules around it. I've also been watching stuff about history of Transformers discussions, like this guy talking about all the kind of disparate Transformers universes, and this was something I loved when I was a kid, like the UK Transformers comic. It was what my 32p pocket money went on every week. I like this Transformers writer because I like the comics, but then when I found out the way that he'd explain the existence of female Transformers before they decided that they were going to change it so that there wasn't such a thing, but then sort of later they changed it back again. But the explanation for the existence of them was that some human women's rights activists were protesting, so they had to exist. So that they had to be manufactured.
That was in the comic.
It was like the Transformers. All right,
so
mate.
A comic aimed at like 8-year-olds.
Yeah, like some in this. There's these alien robots from space that come to Earth and have their war from all these battles, and then in the comic when they needed to explain why they existed, when they sort of said that they didn't exist before or whatever. Women's rights activist, women's lib.
It's not a very imaginative explanation, is it?
It's
like my mum made me do it.
Yeah, very disappointing. Very disappointing. So, that's sort of made me think, Simon Furman, come on, you can do better than that. And who is still writing the comics even now, decades later.
Should we write to him?
I might have to say, Simon, what the hell?
Write him a sternly worded letter.
I'll put the link. I'll put the video up for that. And finally, I played a sort of like this friend of mine who is a sort of techno DJ and into music hardware and got me into modular synths sort of a couple of years ago. He was doing this sort of open mic, but you sort of bring drum machines or whatever night. So I sort of brought some gear along to that last night and played a little bit of music, played some music with this sort of 21-year-old music student who had some sort of noise-making boxes, and I tried to make it sound like a bit more like dance music. And this is something for ages I've thought it'd be. I think it's really interesting how if instead of having pre-recorded music, there's so much you can do with connected music equipment to kind of create that sort of techno, sort of dance music just as you go. I thought this was a really rich vein, but it was sort of last night seeing it done really well by this guy, Tom Bulwer. He'd sort of really well prepared lots of very expensive equipment as well. Then seeing other people trying and there being, there's always technical problems. There's always like, you can't quite hear what you're doing. Sound is a really hard thing to get right. And if it's off, it's off. Like, so if the mix is a bit off. So when I was playing, the other guys, it was a bit loud. It sort of cut through awkwardly and it was a bit loud. And then my stuff, I'd touch something and it would crackle a little bit. And there's so many ways in which sound can be bad. And, it's a weirdly difficult thing. So, and I'm starting to have second thoughts about whether you can sort of generalize that type of musical performance because there's so much consumer hardware, so much stuff you can buy and do it. But it's so easy for it to sort of not sound good or get a bit repetitive or get a bit boring, that maybe it is something that just singular artists can pull off and it's not really something that you can like broaden out and become more of a wider sort of trend.
Isn't that though a function part of the complexity of the machine? I mean, your violin can be out of tune or your piano could be out of tune, but there's not that much variation in wrongness.
Well,
whereas with if you plug in a load of complex machine instruments, then there's just more to go wrong.
Well, with digital,
or more to not get right.
So it's particularly with digital equipment, and something I learned at university in a sort of signals and noise lecture. The thing is, the military don't use digital transmissions.
No.
Because when digital goes wrong, it just cuts out entirely or it can just stop entirely. Whereas analog, there's that kind of, you can sort of maybe listen harder and figure it out. So, and the same with sort of digital music gear and analog gear. So my gear's mostly analog now, which means that it's slightly less prone to this thing of, with digital equipment, you can just like nudge the wrong thing and it can just completely change the entire sound just with a kind of whisker, and that can be a real, you can just accidentally turn it off or you can accidentally, it tends to be quite all or nothing.
Well, I mean, by definition, it's sampled, not, it's not a continuous wave.
Yeah. So
it's like, by definition, basically, if you're just sampling something and then the something's not quite right, it very quickly deteriorates or disappears. Yeah.
And with sort of software synthesizing and stuff, it's just like, you've got to be so gentle with it and you can't really thrash it like a guitar. You can't really, and that's a source of frustration for me,
I kind of think that what you're not saying that it's not possible. Your conclusion is wrong.
Well, my conclusion is it takes a lot of skill to pull it off, and it's not something that's, I think, is as accessible as I thought it was.
I don't think it's accessible because of the equipment thing, basically. And you need the skill in the equipment.
Oh, God.
You need more complex technical skills. Because I don't want to sound like I'm saying you don't need skill to play a violin really well or play a piano, but it's just you kind of need to have skills in music and in technology in order to do it. And
it gets pretty rarefied, and
Well, I mean, and let's face it, the way you solve problems with kit is by being methodical, narrow thinking, step by step, and the way you need to think when you're being creative is all free and open mind, and it's kind of a conflict. So I'm not surprised that I think it's very hard not to get frustrated in those situations because you're in conflict with yourself for starters.
And it's
and
you want to kind of prepare, like the technical side, you want to kind of be prepared by doing that. But then in the moment, you just want to be present.
Yes.
And I think I did. I mean, I guess I'll link to the live stream. Like, I think we pulled off some good moments. But yeah, it was just, it's just like, it's hard to, switch between those two modes, as you say. How was your week, Ivanka? How's the foot? Is it better? Have you been running?
No, I haven't been running, partly because we've got to drive across Europe and I didn't really want to make it worse because I didn't want to go for a run and then upset it. But I have done a lot of walking. I've been walking normally. I've been wearing this support thing and I've, run up the stairs at the station to get a train and stuff because I had to go to London 3 times this week.
Again, you might as well move back.
3. I went, and yesterday, just as I was about to get on the train, that dreaded thing happened where the timetable just went red with cancelled trains. I was like, oh. So the ankle is definitely on the mend. I had a very good week, actually. I ran a training course for how to do user research analysis. And I was a little bit... I wanted to do a good job. So I was I haven't run a training course for a very long time. And this part of my new career direction is user research coaching and training and that kind of thing. But analysis is quite an interesting thing to try and teach because it's a qualitative activity. So I'm not teaching anyone any sums or anything. I thought quite long and hard about how to do it. But I think I had very good feedback. I made the schoolgirl error. I completely neglected to consider when we might have a break and things like that. So I'd focused so much on the content that I'd forgotten to go, and what time does everybody like to have lunch, until it was kind of lunchtime.
Let's talk about judgment. Sometimes I get anxious about something and then someone says, oh, it's because you were worried about people judging you. And I'm like, oh, yeah. What's that feeling of being judged? Why don't we like it?
I always find it a bit unfair. I think
it's reductive.
I have a childish response to it, which is, I think, that I've then over time tried to work with in the self-awareness-y way. I think I have this, but you don't know about, like when you're working on a project that's very public and people are slagging you off on the internet and you're like, you actually just come and do my job for a day and then judge me. So I have a bit of that, a bit of like, that's not fair, you don't know what it's like.
Yeah, but someone does have to be qualified to judge. I'm sort of thinking about the whole kind of Christian thing of Saint Peter at the gates of heaven, who kind of reads you or whatever.
Is that what he
tells
does?
you whether you can come in or not, based on a judgment of your life.
But that's, Saint Peter, he's obviously, qualified in this. He's had training and practice.
Well, yeah. And then judges, you sort of expect. So someone has to. You feel like someone has to be qualified before you're going to accept any judgments.
Yeah.
And if they're not, then it just winds you up, doesn't it? Because you're like, well, you have no right to.
Yeah. When I think of judging, I was thinking more about how I feel when I'm judgy, when I judge people. Yeah. So there is something about being qualified to judge somebody. I suppose that's how, grades are a judge, aren't they?
That's sort of like, so when I think of judgment, I'm thinking of the sort of informal expert type of judgment, whereas sort of where they try to formalise judgments on you through education and through exams and through sort of like normalising how we're going to rank you, assign you scores, IQ tests. It's sort of like technology in that it's supposed to replace an intelligent assessment. You're trying to replace me saying, oh, you seem quite clever, or understanding that someone's quite clever, with here is a sequence of questions at the end of which we can automatically determine whether or not you are intelligent.
I think that's ultimately because as as discussed, I hope maybe in previous episodes, but certainly sort of if you're doing any sort of cognitive psychology, we don't remember anything. We don't see anything properly. We don't hear anything properly. We're an incredibly, we just make everything up. So then I think there's this lack of trust and confidence that then we want to defer to something that's measurable, like this person is this many centimetres high, which is, and we want to apply that to non-tangible characteristics. And I can kind of understand the drive to do that, but I'm not always sure how useful it is.
I think good judgment that's easier to accept, even in terms of like estimating a project. How long is this going to take? You're sort of like having to, I don't know, there's some judgment in that.
Yeah.
But the way I kind of make it easier on myself is by just, easier to explain to a client or someone else, is to just sort of break it down into, okay, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, I've got to do this. That's like 1 day, that's 1 day, that's 1 day, that's 2 days. And just like, if you break it down and say what your data points are, it's easier to take if that person judges you but then presents the data that they have used to form that opinion. That then you feel like you can go, okay, but you're missing this data point. As if someone sort of like just judges you and then doesn't give you a chance. It's just inside their head and it's in their eyes. Yeah. And you can't really defend yourself against that because you don't know where they're coming from so much. Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be judged, you want to know the criteria that you're being judged on. I think that's fair.
That's how it works with beauty pageants and things as well. Like, she's got 5 for cooking, 6 for dancing, 7 for general opinion.
I'm not sure they do cooking, but I like the idea.
I don't know. I feel like dancing. Probably not anymore, but I'm sure they used to.
Possibly, yeah, that's true. It's easier to accept a judgment if you come out of it looking good.
Well, and this is kind of, I don't know if it's connected to things like horoscopes or those kinds of things that are flattering, which is sort of makes you want to believe them. So yes. Like a positive judgment or a positive, someone saying positive things about you is really,
I'm definitely like that.
Really am in tune with my emotions. Yeah.
It's very nice when somebody writes something nice about you on the internet, but we can't attribute that more value than we're attributing a negative one. If you can't, you have to try not to get, just because someone says something nice, you can't let the sort of happiness that provokes outweigh the, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And as a sort of, as an artist, when you put stuff out there, you've got to sort of go, right, I don't want to take on board any of the negative opinions about me, but that also sort of means that I've got to kind of take any praise with a pinch of salt as well. But then it just means it's like, well, what's the point then?
But you do need feedback. A person needs feedback or reinforcement or whatever. That's what it is, isn't it? Based on a criteria that I may or may not divulge to you, I formed this assessment or made this observation.
Right.
Isn't it really?
It's like, that's sort of someone judging you. That's what that's. Yeah, if they're just that sort of like negative sense of you're judging me. Secretly is the subtext to that. You're with secret criteria that I have no access to, so then hence no defence.
I don't really know how different it is to a decision, because it's
a conclusion, right? It's it's like I've reached a conclusion after which I'm going to stop thinking about this. I'm not going to think about you anymore. I've reached my decision.
Yeah. Of all the sort of religious philosophy type things, I think the one that I most like to read about and have for quite a number of years is Buddhism. I find it quite interesting. I do think that despite some of the comments I make on this podcast, I feel that I'm not a particularly judgy person, or if I do judging, I sort of keep it to myself. The people that I have who are my friends, I'm quite accepting of all their foibles, not in a way that's like, oh, that person does that all the time, but more, that's who they are, that's what they do. I want to be friends with them. I've got to accept it. And the sort of Buddhist judging thing is it's sort of making an observation without that negatively impacting on you. So you've got a friend who's always late. You can go, oh, they're always late. Or you can go, they're always late. It's just a statement of, and there is a difference.
Yeah, so I suppose judging something, forming a conclusion is often attached to an emotional response.
Judgment just brings up all sorts of words like forgiveness and because you've made a judgment. So now what are you going to do? What are you going to do with it? Yeah. In this sort of legal sphere of somebody went to court, the evidence was evaluated against some rules that are public.
But I think legal judgment is interesting because it's all around precedent and it's all around one judge kind of setting a precedent. Crazy things happen, and as time has gone on, someone has said, okay, well, I actually think that you've made a good point and there's a good case. But then it seems like those precedents get turned into a sort of currency of their own. It's sort of easier to justify a judgment if there's precedent for it.
Yes.
But then why shouldn't you be setting new precedents all the time? Because the world is full of all sorts of crazy situations that you can't really predict and you certainly can't systematically cover.
I know there's some experiments with like a parking ticket appeal bot, but is there a judge bot around on simple things like parking? Have I imagined that? Where some of these very much more measurable things that need to be judged.
But personally, I think of all of the human faculties that we could automate, I feel like judge is one of the last ones we can sort of figure out, because you need to be you need to be a person with a lifetime of experience, a deep understanding of the world, a deep understanding of the cultures and situations. And I'm sure we'll get there eventually, but like artist, it's very much at the other end of what we can automate.
Yes.
But yeah, like you say, like if there is literally, someone's just following a checklist to check whether or not a parking ticket is required or is appealable, then that's a different sort of thing.
I think one of the things that's hard and that makes it difficult to create the rules and program a judge is the circumstance element. So you've got, a person went past a speed camera and they were driving too fast. So, yes, that's a black and white sort of situation. They either are or they're not, and they get issued with a parking ticket. However, in appeal mindset or appeal land, one could I don't know if this is any legal sort of place, probably a very bad example. I was in the car, my child was really sick and I had to get her to hospital, blah, blah. You can imagine that whilst you probably still have to pay the parking fine or the speeding fine, but the extenuating circumstances I still think you'd get,
Still sets a precedent. It's still like, But things like that, speed of driving is very much a measurable thing. Judgment applies where stuff is less measurable. So even though on one hand, it softens the blow of judgment for someone to tell you what they've measured, what questions they've asked and what conclusions they've reached, when you boil judgment down, it's really the stuff that can't be measured that it's having to kind of make sense of. In
a way, it's almost like giving somebody a parking ticket is more about measuring than judging. Yeah. Because it's just like, the time has run out. So that's a measurement. But then the judging, and even like if we go back to our grading story, like you sit an exam and somebody measures your answers, kind of, they're for correct. And but then the judgment, I'm not sure the grade is a judgment, but rather the thing that comes afterwards where people kind of go, oh, you only got A, or you got A, So I suppose both are, but different. But then I think this is why, I guess that's why I preferred subjects or found subjects easier at school that were more like maths, things like logical, deductive, like science. And whereas something like an English essay where the score is really much based on the judgment of the examiner, especially if you don't know who that's going to be. So you don't know what
sort of thing they're into, it just feels like a bit more of a sort of crapshoot. It's just like, well, I don't know what this person's like. So I sort of preferred the ones where I didn't feel like I would be at the mercy of human judgment. Or maybe I did better at the ones that I wasn't at the mercy of human. I don't know. I think it's different. I think I just didn't know how to save facts into my brain.
I mean,
just better at
the Yugoslav education system, your teacher graded you. There were no central exams. Right. And so they set the questions, they marked them, and if the teacher didn't like you, as occasionally happened with me, if it was maths, it didn't matter that they didn't like you.
Yeah.
Or it didn't necessarily affect you, but if it was a different subject, they could just read your essay and say it was nonsense, and that was bad. Well, there's not a lot you can do about it, really. I had one teacher, because I did enjoy it and was pretty good at maths. And so I did these extra maths classes. And what she would do, because you had to always have a written test and an oral test. So, get on the blackboard, answer this question, solve this. There was this one teacher who really didn't like me. And she would divide the blackboard into two and have me on one side and somebody else on the other. And then she would talk to the other person the whole time whilst I was answering my question. Okay. And then one time she just I'd done mine. I was waiting for her to finish talking to the other person, and she just looked at it and went, "You didn't do that. Somebody helped you," and then dismissed my answer. It's just this. But that's what happens when you're at the mercy of a person who has all the power. They can judge you. They can do whatever they want. Right. It's like they really can. Your recourse is minimal. I can see how, in a way, it did me a few favours. I had a philosophy teacher later on when I was older, and he'd got it into his head that I, wasn't that good a student or whatever. And that's the other thing. They make a judgment on nothing, and then that's the grade they keep giving you. And so he's like, so it was the end of the year and I wanted an A. So he asked me some questions, because that's what they do. You're literally standing in class answering questions in front of everybody, and then a grade is assigned. So I answered the questions. He was like, right, that'll be a B. I was like, no, I know this subject for an A. You've got to ask me some more questions, until you're satisfied that I know this subject for an A. And he was like, come on then, Mike, what about this? And then you kind of then have a opportunity with some people like that to actually take them on and go, no, your judgment is wrong.
Right.
Let me explain.
It's not time for judgment. I need more. Yeah, that's the only way to you've just got to kind of drag it out. And I suppose that's why, in legal things, it's like you've got that choice of, do I drag this out indefinitely, or do I just kind of put a lid on it and just kind of like say, okay, fine, I lost, But the last time that's anything like that happened to me was this passport thing, like where, I'm sort of having to... I mean, in this case, it was me giving the person behind the desk enough evidence and bits of things in order for the judgment of her manager to be in favour of me getting expedited thing. But completely the mercy of someone that, and you could just, even when she told it to me, I could just see this kind of this sort of arrogant attitude of someone looking at a thing, well, I just didn't know. And just that sort of snap kind of, I know everything that's happened, but in that situation, she just kept going back and back on my behalf as we kind of uncovered more possible things we could use and just kind of fueled it as much as possible. So
but you need you need the person doing the judging to afford you the opportunity.
Yes,
and maybe that's in a situation where we're judging. It's those snap judgments that I think are most offensive and most wrong, And
this is where people tie themselves in knots on Twitter, because someone says something about you, making a judgment, and the temptation is to want to reason with them and argue with them. And then they either, if they don't reply, you're like, well, you're not, then that hurts. But if they do and they're still judging, you can't seem to convince them. And YouTube comments as well, just you get sucked in this spiral of trying to just give me one more chance with this new information. Just I'm just giving you a little bit more information each time. Just please change your opinion. But the other person isn't remotely motivated to.
But I think, but that's partly I seem to be using the phrase "a function of the facts" today, but it's partly a function of the fact that in normal life, you meet somebody or walk past somebody in the street and intentionally or unintentionally you form some sort of opinion of them, some sort of judgment. They don't know.
No.
And so therefore, you've just passed somebody on the street, they've decided you look lazy or whatever, and that's that. I mean, it doesn't bother you at all. Whereas on Twitter, frankly, these people are doing not much more than passing you in the street, except that they're using their inside voice and writing it down and putting it on the internet. So for you to see, it's like, whoa, excuse me. I mean, it's a waste of our own energy forming, negative judgments about strangers, frankly. I think people that we work with, it's good to try and give people the chance to, more than 2 seconds for you to form an opinion of them and act upon it. Maybe it gets filed, but check in every so often and see if the evidence, given more time and more evidence, is your initial judgment still true?
I think I often sort of misjudge people a bit on first impressions, and I've had this with people that have a sort of like cartoonish appearance on first impressions, like someone that I worked with that I kind of like wore really, really sort of flamboyant clothes and was always had some sort of crazy thing going on, and I was sort of like, it's like you dress like a children's TV presenter. And then I'd sort of like, I just can't deal with you. But then we sort of became quite, good friends. And I just realised that she was just like, it wasn't like superficial. It was sort of like just how she lived. And so in that case, I was able to accept it then. Whereas when you sort of like initially judge it and go, why would you let yourself look like that?
This is the unfortunate thing of like inside voice and outside. It's like with interviewing people for jobs.
Yeah.
We all know that there's loads of literature about snap judgments, and you make your opinion or you have 2 seconds to make it blah, blah, blah. Because basically for me, the interview process is in part me spending, an hour and a half checking to see if my, working out if what I thought was correct.
If what from the CV?
Like somebody walks in the room and you think, they open their mouth, they show you something or they say something and you're like, huh? Well, I had a friend of mine was talking about somebody who she hasn't met face to face yet. And he sent one email that sounded a bit odd, but she was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's the phrase I'm looking for, benefit of the doubt. Yeah. And but then there was a second email or some other interaction, which again didn't reflect well on him. And then she was having a conversation with someone who knew him and she was like, have I just formed a snap opinion or is he an arrogant knobhead? Yeah. She said, it was like, is he just awkward or is he arrogant? Why is he, what's his problem?
You've got, that's that Larry David thing. You've got a shy asshole confusion. He's not shy, he's not an asshole, he's shy. No, I think he's an asshole.
Yeah.
So you can just ask someone, is this if someone else kind of gives you permission, the person can ask you for a second chance, or you can ask someone else if you should give the person a second chance. Yeah. But there's also that, and we've talked about this not on the podcast, about that interviewing people, and when you sort of have a feeling about someone, if you're sort of not sure about someone, but then you sort of really need to hire someone, you're like, okay, well, you sort of ignore the thing that you weren't sure about, and then as soon as they start, it's like, oh, that was a really big deal. Why didn't we keep interviewing? So that kind of like, sometimes you have got to trust your gut. You've got to sort of like, with interviewing, it's funny, isn't it? Like you really can't ignore, but then it's not that you can't be surprised, but usually if you're kind of picking up on something when you do first meet someone, then there's a chance that that's quite a core part of their person, and that you should trust your gut.
It is really difficult.
But then it does. That's why you don't just kind of immediately kick them out the room. And sometimes you can they can change your mind after a while. You can be like, right, I thought this about you, but then I realised, right, okay. Yeah. Or it can go the other way as well. It'd be like, oh, you're talking about.
But you've also got to be willing to be wrong.
Yes,
which I think that's part of the problem as well, which is that, being allowed to be wrong is not a sign of strength or leadership for some reason, which I think is, we've definitely made this point before, discussed it before in the context of politics, but what is wrong with going, I met this person, I thought they were an arsehole, but actually they're shy. So what's wrong with that? That's
nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, that's fine. Most of us do come across, like I'm at my most awkward when I'm uncomfortable or shy meeting or in a room with everyone's new. So I can't bear networking events. However much I practice that, hello, stranger. It's like, I don't like it.
Even with the my-itch training. But that's why last night fucked me off so much, because just 2 gratuitous swears this week. I'm sort of counting them going, well, was that needed? Because, I'm meeting people for the first time and suddenly I'm, being angry in front of them, and that's the only data point they have about me now, and it's your fault for making me do stuff on the computer. You get, if people are emotional and have different moods, then if you meet them when they're in one mood and don't know the range of their moods, or maybe just the fact that they can be in that particularly strong mood means that you're like, oh, they're a moody person. So even if they're not always in this mood, then can't be bothered.
I find it increasingly difficult when I'm annoyed, hiding it. I used to be able to, I think, fake it. I just can't now, and it's just
what's the point? What's the point of hiding it? I don't know.
It's like, in a work context, I think somebody, a friend who was working with me said, you did a very good job. I'm really fucked off, and this is not okay, without actually losing your shit. I was like, oh, thank you. It's like, I think that's a skill. But I'm not sure. Because sometimes you don't want people to know that they got to you.
Right, but, yeah, well, that's
which is where judging yourself comes in.
The sort of person you are, how harshly you judge yourself. You do judge yourself more harshly than you would anyone else. And one of the things they tell you if you're sort of depressed is like, if this was someone else, would you say that to them? Given these circumstances, to try and I don't know if it really works. You're like, but that would be someone else. That's not me. I need to.
Yeah. It's like twisting your ankle in a rabbit hole and going, you idiot. Would you have said that to somebody else? Might not have said it, might have thought it.
But then, that is, if someone does hate themselves, then there's a chance they will be an arsehole, because they will kind of just jump to those conclusions about you as well.
Yeah, and I think this is where my Jesus quote comes in. I found a Jesus quote.
Jesus quote.
No, very vague. But that whole "do not judge so that you may not be judged."
Right.
Because it says, "For the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you'll get."
I suppose that sort of ties in, doesn't it?
And then there was this Buddhist monk guy that I came across many years ago called Buddhist monk guy. It's probably the most, disrespectful. Then I got a Jesus quote. I'm not very good at religion. But Thich Nhat Hanh, his name is. And he wrote, apparently he came under some pressure at some point because he refused to judge a pirate that had raped a young girl. And he's not a defence of the pirate, but his sort of explanation was, if I had been born in the village of the pirate and raised in the same conditions as he was, I am now the pirate, but not yet capable of seeing and loving. And it's like that's actually, I'm using the quote in the wrong context, because what we're talking about is that if you're judging yourself on whatever you judge yourself on, you're going to judge other people on.
Yes, because that's what you're going to be looking for. Yeah, it comes down to that's how we work, what we're looking for. If we're looking for criticisms, and that's something I grew up mostly doing, and I have a very finely tuned critical eye. Then that's what you're going to be looking. Whereas if you're looking for beautiful things, and if you're looking for to enjoy nice things, then that's how you're going to perceive the world, and that's how you're going to judge the world.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's judgment. Just even on the basics, we were talking about sort of exams and the fact that Donald Trump is still willing to assign numbers to women. Like that kind of grotesque sort of like oversimplification, that sort of like reductionist mindset that seems to carry across to his judgment of everything, doesn't it? Totally oversimplify it to the point of absurdity, and then make very strong claims and make very kind of big actions as a result of these utterly kind of shallow judgments.
It's amazing how much that says about him. That sort of the numbers to women thing.
She was a 6.
It's not just misogyny. It's not just arrogance or it's not just. It's so many things about the way his brain works. It's just horrific. I had my favourite little Facebook thing I've seen this week, because I do just get... I seem somehow plugged more into American politics, I think, than British sometimes. I shared this picture of a guy standing outside, I think from the back of the head, it's a guy holding up a banner outside the White House, says TikTok motherfucker on it. It's like TikTok. It's so sinister and funny at the same time. It's like
he'll get locked up by the bloody Secret Service when if that's interpreted in the wrong way. But then people have been saying that from the start, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. He's going to end up serving this whole term. But then on the subject of judgment and law, not one, but 2 people that he's closely associated with have been arrested and charged at, they are criminals. They're not just like, didn't inhale or whatever. But so is Hillary. Hillary's a criminal, kind of, if you believe some fake news articles I saw.
This is now no longer a matter of people's opinions and backgrounds. People that he is strongly associated. But it's the same as the Leave campaign. I'm not finishing my sentences. They've cheated financially to no consequences.
No fucking consequences. Reality does not exist. Consequences aren't real. Donald Trump is successfully changing reality by not believing in it. And this is very worrying.
It's just, it's like either we are a banana republic where people just do, that's grossly corrupt and people win elections based on whatever they fancy, or we're not. And then these people need to face consequences.
But coming back to judgment, it's sort of like in your leaders, you want a supreme level of judgment skill at judging situations. That's what you want. Like, that's what you're looking for. So that's why it's, and you can talk about Cameron's judgment on the referendum, doing the referendum, and just absolute total failure of judgment that has just left us all in the shit. And because that's what you want from leaders, and we're not getting it anymore.
No, I had somebody, I don't know, randomly, I was like, because I was on the train, I've been on Twitter a bit more than usual, because, so I've got this like bit of, focus time. And somebody that I was following tweeted something that was like, a good programmer looks both ways when crossing a one-way street.
Okay.
Which I thought, sure, But actually, you could extend that. I was like, does this expand? It's like a good product manager looks both ways when crossing a one-way street, sees a car travelling the wrong way, asks if everyone sees it, discusses the speed and impact with the team, and then, depending on advice and data, decides whether we should cross the road anyway. If you're going to be responsible for any sorts of judgments or decisions of a country or a product or a team, you've got to be constantly scanning for risk but using information and data and experts to go, no, actually, it doesn't matter. The car's miles away. It's not going to hit us. We can all cross the road. Whereas I think if you're just reducing everything to this car scores 1, then you're just not looking broader. You're not casting your measuring wide enough.
You've stopped thinking too soon. So,
Yes.
judgment,
Yes.
you've stopped collecting data immediately.
Yeah.
And so you're going to only make bad judgments.
Yes, especially as most things in this modern life. So the brain must be programmed biologically. And I bet there is theory about this, or it feels familiar, but maybe I'm making it up. It's like if your monkey brain needs to react to the presence of a predator, there's not a great length of time now to assess that. And blah, blah, blah. So making snap judgments, important survival skill.
Yeah.
In the complex world that we live in, where that thing that you've just seen out of your corner eye is probably not a lion that's coming to eat you, you could take a little bit more time and work out what it is and what you're going to do about it. And this
is one of the roots of, one of the reasons where there are now more suicides than the murders in the world, because all this kind of this mental framework that's designed for survival and snap judgments and making those sorts of and reacting to those things are now being just mis-triggered all the time. Like you're getting this stimulus from all over the place all the time that's triggering these biological responses that are completely inappropriate. And so it's causing, a lot of mental health problems, a lot of unhappiness. And we don't have it doesn't trigger the sort of psychological defense mechanisms in the way that actual danger does.
No.
So you just get the bad parts of it. You just get the prejudice. You just get the sort of self-hate and all those things that come around from that. It's something you've got to stay on top of and be aware of, and they're not really teaching it.
This is the second conversation this week where this idea that the brain was evolved for circumstances that no longer exist, including we were talking about consumption and growth and capitalism and the fact that it needs to change in that context. But as humans, we're like, I need more, I need to pay, I need more, I need more. And that's a biological survival thing. Yeah. And as the question was, how long do you think, will we evolve, and how long does evolution take, and what can we evolve fast enough?
We can't. Well, unless we kind of get our fingers in it, which which I think we're going to start having to do one way or another, but that's going to go very badly. And then are we still human if we don't have these? Isn't humanity these legacy structures? Because we're not going to change now, really, because the environment needs to be stable for millennia in order for natural selection to take place. Maybe on a social level, like it's like just in terms of dating and reproduction, it may not be people dying before they get a chance to reproduce, but I guess we'll be selecting for slightly different characteristics still on some level. But the fact that the playing field is constantly changing means that there's
no
you
opportunity.
can't have consistent kind of like opportunities for a direction. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.
If you like the podcast, come to grandpodcast.com. You can come and look at the library. You can see all the links. So if we've mentioned a video, if we've mentioned a blog post, then you should be able to find that in the show notes and also on our library.
People can find me at Ivanka on Twitter.
And you can find me at michaelforestmusic.com. And if you want to help, please share our podcast. Please write us some reviews on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We've got a little handful of some 5 stars. I had a look at that. We've got sort of 14, I think.
Have we?
Yeah,
Yay!
14 5-star reviews. So that's nice.
Thank you very much.
So keep them coming. Thanks very much to everyone that did submit a review. A gift basket is on its way. And it's not, I don't even know what a gift basket is. So I've been watching too much Hollywood stuff.
Tell your friends that actually it's not that hard. It's not homework.
And there's still no adverts on this, which is nice for you, isn't it? Because I've been listening to some new podcasts recently, and they're just very adverty. Maybe the fact that we don't necessarily need ads to support this means that we can make that a selling point. But then if at some point we end up putting dynamic ads into all of our episodes, then this is going to sound pretty stupid. All right, thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Bye, 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 bye.